I first noticed it on a Tuesday morning. The note wasn't alarming at first glance, just a small piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. I figured it was a flyer or one of those ads for a local car wash, the kind you find littered all over parking lots. But it wasn't. The handwriting was neat and precise, like someone had spent way too much time on it. The words were unsettling. "You looked beautiful today." For a moment, I just stared at it, the words sinking in. I looked around the lot, my apartment complex's usual patchwork of cars and scattered garbage. No one seemed to be watching, and there were no other notes on nearby cars. I stuffed the paper into my bag, shaking off the unease. Someone's dumb idea of a prank, I told myself. I didn't have time to dwell on it, I had a meeting downtown and couldn't afford to be late. Life in Sacramento had always been comforting in its predictability. I had my routines, yoga classes at dawn, trips to the Midtown Farmers Market on Saturdays, and happy hours with friends when we could coordinate our chaotic schedules. The following Saturday, I was picking out peaches at the market when I had the strange feeling of being watched. You know that prickling sensation at the back of your neck, like you're a character in a horror movie? That's what it felt like. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone staring. Nothing. Just the usual mix of families, couples, and vendors. But the feeling didn't leave. When I got back to my car, I found another note. This time, it wasn't complimentary. "You shouldn't walk alone." My stomach sank. I spent that night trying to brush it off. A prank, I thought. A coincidence. I called my best friend, Lila, and told her about it. "Emma, that's not normal," she said. "You need to tell someone." I laughed it off, more for my benefit than hers. "Who am I going to tell? The police?" "Hey, some random notes showed up on my car. They'll tell me to stop parking in public places." But Lila wasn't buying it. What if it's more than that? People don't just leave notes like that for no reason. By the time we hung up, she had convinced me to keep my guard up. But I still wasn't ready to call the police. Not yet. It wasn't until a week later that things escalated. I'd been working late, catching up on emails for a big project at the marketing agency where I worked. By the time I got home, it was almost midnight, and the parking lot was eerily quiet. When I stepped out of my car, I felt it again, that prickling sensation. My eyes darted around, scanning the shadows. Nothing. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. Later that night, as I sat on the couch binge-watching Netflix to calm my nerves, I heard something outside my window. A soft scraping sound, like someone brushing against the siding. My breath hitched. I muted the TV and sat frozen, straining to hear. The sound came again, faint but deliberate. Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a lamp, and pulled back the curtain. No one was there. The next morning, I discovered my spare apartment key was missing. I kept it hidden in a magnetic box under the railing outside my door, a habit I'd never thought twice about. Now it was gone. My chest tightened as panic set in. Was I imagining this? I'd used the key just a few days ago. Maybe I misplaced it. But deep down, I knew the truth. Lila didn't give me a choice this time. "You're calling the police," she insisted over the phone. "This isn't some stupid prank, Emma. Someone's targeting you." I hated the idea. I didn't want to be that person, the one overreacting to something that could have a perfectly logical explanation. But the missing key felt like crossing a line. When I got to the Sacramento Police Department, I was nervous. What if they didn't take me seriously? The officer at the front desk seemed polite but uninterested as I explained what had happened. "You found a couple of notes and a missing key," he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," I said, feeling the heat rise in my face. "And someone was outside my window last night." He scribbled something in his notebook. It could be a coincidence. Or maybe someone found the key and... Someone found the key and what? Returned it by lurking outside her window? The voice came from behind me. I turned to see a tall man in a leather jacket, his sharp eyes narrowing at the officer. Detective Marcus Holt, he introduced himself, flashing his badge. I'll take it from here. Detective Holt had a presence about him, the kind that made you feel like he'd seen everything and still cared enough to help. As we sat in a small interview room, I told him everything, the notes, the missing key, the noise outside my window. He listened intently, his pen moving steadily across his notepad. "You're not imagining this," he said when I finished. "We'll open a case and start looking into it." Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with fear. If he believed me, it meant this was real. That evening, Holt and another officer came to my apartment to install a security camera outside my door. "This will give us eyes on anyone trying to get in," Holt explained, positioning the small device above the frame. As he worked, I found myself asking, "Do you get a lot of cases like this?" "More than you'd think," he replied. "But stalking is personal. It's about power and control. That's what makes it dangerous." His words stuck with me long after they left. 2 days later, I found another note taped to my door. "I see you've been talking to the police. That's cute." I handed it to Holt that evening, my hands trembling. He examined it, his jaw tightening. "They're getting bolder," he said. "But that's a mistake. The more they reveal, the closer we get." I wanted to believe him. But the thought of someone watching me, knowing my every move, was suffocating. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the apartment felt like a threat, every shadow a warning. At around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with a notification from the security camera. Someone was at my door. My heart raced as I opened the app, the screen showing a grainy figure standing just beyond the light. They were wearing a hoodie, their face obscured, but they didn't move. I called Holt immediately. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and alert. "I'm on my way. Don't open the door." I didn't. I just sat there, clutching my phone, as the figure lingered for what felt like an eternity. When Holt arrived, the figure was gone. The day after the figure appeared on my security camera, Holt and I sat in his unassuming office, the space cluttered with stacks of case files and a coffee mug that read, "World's okayest detective." "I've already pulled the footage from your camera," he said, typing something on his computer. "But whoever this is, they're smart. They stayed out of the light just enough to keep their face hidden." "Great," I muttered, sinking into my chair. "So, what now?" Holt leaned forward, his expression calm but firm. "Now, we focus on patterns. Stalkers thrive on access, routine, vulnerabilities. We'll dig into your life and see who fits." The idea of someone in my life being behind this made my stomach churn. That afternoon, Holt came to my apartment to discuss potential suspects. He asked me to go through everyone I interacted with regularly, friends, co-workers, neighbors. As we talked, a sickening thought crept into my mind. There's this guy at work. Evan. Evan was harmless, I thought. A little awkward, sure, but never threatening. He'd bring me coffee sometimes, linger by my desk for chats that went on a bit too long. Holt didn't dismiss it. "Sometimes, it's the people we least expect," he said. I hated the idea of accusing anyone without proof, but something about Evan's behavior suddenly felt off. Over the next few days, the stalker grew bolder. Another note appeared, this time shoved under my door. "You can't hide behind him forever." I showed it to Holt immediately. His jaw tightened as he studied it. "They're testing boundaries," he said. "Trying to see how far they can push you before you break." That night, I stayed at Lila's apartment, too shaken to sleep in my own. 2 days later, at work, I opened my desk drawer to find a single red rose lying on top of my files. My heart pounded as I looked around the office. Everyone seemed focused on their computers, oblivious to the fact that my world was crumbling. I called Holt from the bathroom, my hands shaking. "They're here," I whispered. "Stay calm," he said. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't confront anyone." I didn't. But as I walked back to my desk, I felt eyes on me. When Holt arrived, he requested a list of employees who'd had access to the office overnight. Only a few names stood out, including Evans. "I'll look into him," Holt promised, his tone measured. "But we can't rule out anyone just yet." That evening, he asked me more questions about my routines. "Have you noticed anyone following you? Any unfamiliar cars?" I shook my head. "No, but now I feel like everyone's watching me." "You're not imagining it," he said. "People like this thrive on fear. That's why we're going to stop them." I returned to my apartment the next day to find my front door ajar. My blood ran cold as I pushed it open, the air inside eerily still. The living room was untouched, but in my bedroom, drawers had been pulled out, their contents dumped onto the floor. A photo of me and Lila from college had been ripped in half, the pieces left on my bed. I stumbled back into the hallway and called Holt. "Don't go back inside," he said firmly. "I'm on my way." When Holt arrived, he swept through the apartment, his gun drawn. Once he confirmed the stalker was gone, he called in a team to dust for prints. "Look at this," he said, pointing to my mirror. Scrawled in red lipstick were the words, "You belong to me." I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. How did they get in?" "I locked everything." Holt's expression was grim. "They either picked the lock or had a key." The missing spare key flashed in my mind, and my stomach churned. The forensic team found fingerprints on the mirror, and Holt promised to run them through their database. "That's a break," he said, though his tone was cautious. "If this person has a record, we'll know who they are soon." But even with that hope, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't safe. Holt must have sensed it. "Before leaving," he said, "we'll catch them, Emma. I promise." That night, my phone rang from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. At first, there was silence. Then, a distorted voice said, "You shouldn't trust him." I hung up, my heart pounding. When I told Holt about it, he sighed. "They're trying to isolate you. Don't let them. Stick close to the people who care about you." The next day, Holt installed a second camera inside my apartment. "They're escalating," he said. "This will help us catch them if they come back." That night, I sat on my couch, staring at the monitor feed on my phone. Every creak of the apartment felt like a warning, every shadow a threat. At 2 a.m., the camera outside my door sent a notification. I opened the feed to see someone standing there again, this time with their hood down, their face partially visible. It was Evan. The following morning, Holt called me into the station. I sat in his office, my nerves frayed as he reviewed the footage. "It's definitely Evan," he said, pausing the video on the grainy image of the man standing at my door. "But we need more than this to press charges. If he's the one leaving the notes, breaking in, and stalking you, we'll need to tie him to everything." "Isn't this enough?" I asked, my voice shaking. "It's strong, but not airtight," Holt replied. "We'll need to dig deeper." Facing Evan at work felt impossible, but Holt encouraged me to keep my routine. "If you act differently, it might tip him off that we're watching," he explained. At the office, I avoided Evan as much as I could, but he didn't seem fazed. He greeted me as though nothing had changed, his demeanor friendly, almost cheerful. "Hey, Emma," he said, placing a cup of coffee on my desk. "You seemed stressed yesterday. Thought you might need this." I forced a smile, every muscle in my body screaming to run. "Thanks. When he walked away, I texted Holt, he brought me coffee. Again. Holt replied immediately, don't drink it. We'll test it for anything suspicious. That evening, Holt called me with an update. I ran a background check on Evan. No criminal record, but there's a restraining order filed against him by an ex-girlfriend 2 years ago. My stomach sank. What happened? She claimed he wouldn't leave her alone after they broke up, Holt said. Harassment, obsessive behavior. She dropped the case after he agreed to stay away. So he's done this before, I said, my voice barely a whisper. It looks that way, Holt replied. But we need direct evidence tying him to what's happening now. 2 nights later, I returned home to find my apartment door ajar again. Holt arrived minutes after my frantic call, his expression grim as he examined the scene. Inside, the living room was untouched, but my bedroom told a different story. The contents of my drawers were once again strewn across the floor, and a single item lay neatly placed on my bed, a photo of me at a recent work event. This wasn't random, Holt said, snapping photos. He's sending a message. But it was what Holt found next that chilled me to the core. Hidden beneath the bed was a small camera, its lens pointed directly at where I slept. Back at the station, Holt reviewed the footage from the hidden camera. The timestamp on the files showed that the camera had been installed days ago, likely during one of the break-ins. It's all about control, Holt explained, his tone dark. Stalkers thrive on knowing their victims' every move. This gives him access to your most vulnerable moments. The footage revealed glimpses of Evan entering my apartment late at night, rummaging through my belongings. Watching it made me feel exposed, violated in ways I couldn't put into words. This is enough to get a warrant, Holt said. We'll search his apartment. Holt and his team executed the search warrant 2 days later. I waited anxiously for updates, pacing my apartment like a caged animal. When Holt called, his voice was tight with anger. We found what we needed, he said. Evan's apartment was a shrine to his obsession. There were photos of me, taken without my knowledge, at work, at the farmer's market, even through my apartment window. A notebook detailed my daily routines in meticulous handwriting, right down to the time I usually left for yoga. But the most chilling find was a folder labeled Emma's Future. Inside were plans for what Evan called our life together, including marriage proposals and vacation itineraries. With enough evidence to make an arrest, Holt moved quickly to detain Evan. But when officers arrived at his apartment, he was gone. He must have realized we were onto him, Holt told me, frustration evident in his voice. We'll issue a warrant and alert patrol units, but for now, I need you to stay somewhere safe. I moved in with Lila that night, my fear mounting with every passing hour. Holt devised a plan to draw Evan out. He's obsessed with you, he explained. If he thinks you're alone and vulnerable, he'll make a move. The plan involved me returning to my apartment while Holt and his team watched from a nearby surveillance van. It felt risky, but Holt assured me I'd be safe. Trust me, he said, his gaze steady. We won't let him get near you. That night, I sat in my apartment, pretending to go about my normal routine while my heart raced with fear. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, set me on edge. Around midnight, the camera feed alerted Holt to movement near my door. Evan was there, his face twisted with a mixture of anger and desperation. Stay calm, Holt said through the earpiece he'd given me. We've got him. Evan tried the doorknob, then used a key, my missing spare, to let himself in. The moment he stepped inside, Holt and his team stormed in, guns drawn. Evan Morgan, you're under arrest. Holt shouted. Evan froze, his eyes darting between me and the officers. For a moment, I thought he might lunge at me, but Holt grabbed him, forcing him to the ground. Evan was taken into custody, charged with multiple counts of stalking, harassment, and breaking and entering. Holt sat with me afterward, his calm demeanor finally breaking. You were brave, Emma, he said. You helped us stop him before things got worse. I nodded, though my emotions were still raw. Relief, fear, and anger swirled inside me, but above all, I felt gratitude. Holt had believed me when others dismissed my concerns, and his dedication had saved my life. As I left the station that night, I knew I still had a long road ahead to feel safe again. But I also knew I wasn't alone. Evan's arrest brought an immediate sense of relief, but it was far from the end. Holt warned me that stalking cases often had complex legal proceedings, and Evan's behavior might escalate once he realized he couldn't control the situation. He's in custody now, Holt said, sitting across from me in the station's interview room. But we need to prepare for what comes next. Restraining orders, court appearances, this isn't over. I nodded, my hands gripping the edge of the table. What if he gets out? We'll make sure you're protected, Holt promised. The days following Evan's arrest were tense. I avoided going into work, opting to work remotely while Lila's apartment became my temporary safe haven. Holt updated me on the investigation. We've been reviewing the evidence from Evan's apartment, he said during one of our calls. The journals, the photos, it's clear he's been fixated on you for a long time. What do you mean by a long time? I asked, my throat tightening. Months, Holt replied. Maybe longer. He mentioned seeing you at the farmer's market last year. That's when it started. The idea that Evan had been silently watching me for so long was suffocating. Evan's ex-girlfriend, Rachel, came forward after hearing about his arrest in the news. Holt brought her in for an interview, and what she revealed added another layer to the story. He's always been intense, Rachel said, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. At first, it felt flattering. He'd text me all the time, show up with flowers, even surprise me at work. But then it got darker. She described how Evan had followed her to social gatherings, sent her dozens of texts when she didn't respond, and even broken into her apartment once to leave her a gift. I dropped the restraining order because he promised to leave me alone, Rachel said, tears streaming down her face. I didn't think he'd move on to someone else. Holt's jaw clenched as he listened. Your story might help strengthen Emma's case, he said gently. Holt explained that stalkers like Evan often operated on obsessive fixations. For someone like Evan, he said during a meeting at the station, it's not about love or attraction. It's about control. He built an entire narrative in his head where you were the centerpiece, and when reality didn't match, he tried to force it. I felt sick. So this was all a fantasy? An unhealthy one, Holt replied. But that doesn't make it any less dangerous. The restraining order was a given, but the prosecution wanted to pursue charges beyond just stalking. Holt explained the stakes. If we can show the breaking and entering, the surveillance, and the physical evidence as part of a larger pattern, we can get a stronger sentence, he said. Evan's lawyer argued that the notes and gifts were harmless gestures, and that the camera was misunderstood. The defense tried to paint him as socially awkward, not malicious. But the evidence told a different story, the meticulous journals, the invasive photos, the stolen spare key. The trial was a grueling process. Sitting in the courtroom, just feet away from Evan, was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. He avoided my gaze, his demeanor calm and detached, as if none of this affected him. Holt testified about the investigation, his steady voice breaking down the evidence piece by piece. Rachel also took the stand, her testimony reinforcing the pattern of Evan's behavior. When it was my turn, I told the court about the fear that had consumed my life, the night spent wondering if I'd wake up to find him standing over me, the helplessness of knowing someone was always watching. Evan's lawyer tried to undermine my testimony, suggesting I had misinterpreted his client's actions. Is it possible that these notes were just meant to be flattering? The lawyer asked, a smirk playing on his lips. No, I replied, my voice firm. They were meant to scare me. And they did. Holt's evidence and Rachel's testimony painted a damning picture, one the defense couldn't refute. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty. Evan was sentenced to several years in prison, a decision that brought a wave of relief. But as Holt reminded me, the psychological scars would take longer to heal. Justice is a process, he said. But you've taken the first step. In the weeks following the trial, I worked on reclaiming my life. I moved to a new apartment in a different neighborhood, set up more advanced security measures, and leaned heavily on Lila and my other friends for support. Holt checked in periodically, his tone always reassuring. "You're stronger than you think, Emma," he said during one of our calls. "Don't let him take anything more from you." Months later, I wrote a letter to the Sacramento Police Department, specifically thanking Holt for his dedication. "You believed me when I didn't believe myself," I wrote. "You gave me the courage to fight back, and because of you, I feel safe again." Holt never responded directly, but I heard from a mutual friend in the department that he kept the letter on his desk. In time, the fear faded. The shadows Evan cast over my life grew dimmer, replaced by a renewed sense of control and strength. I survived, not just because of Holt, but because I refused to let fear define me. After the trial, life didn't return to normal overnight. I still jumped at unexpected sounds and avoided places where I might feel trapped. But I was learning to live again. Moving into my new apartment felt like shedding an old skin, a way to leave behind the fear and reclaim control. Lila helped me unpack, and as we arranged my books and decorations, she said, "This place feels like you. Bright, safe, full of life." I smiled, but her words stuck with me. Maybe it was time to focus on making my life feel like me again, too. One day, I came across an online forum for stalking survivors. Reading through their stories, I realized how many others had endured similar horrors. Some, like me, had found help through law enforcement. Others weren't as lucky. I started sharing my story, finding solace in the community and offering encouragement to others. "You're not crazy," I wrote in one post. "You're not overreacting. Your safety matters, and there are people who will fight for you." The responses were overwhelming, messages from strangers who said my words made them feel seen. For the first time, I felt like my pain had a purpose. A few months after Evan's sentencing, I was surprised to see Detective Holt standing at my door. "Marcus?" I said, blinking in confusion. "Sorry for showing up unannounced," he said, holding up a folder. "I thought you'd want to know, Evan isn't appealing his sentence. He's accepted the plea deal." Relief flooded me. "Does that mean it's really over?" "For now, yes," he said, his tone cautious but kind. "But we'll keep monitoring him, just in case." I invited him in for coffee, and for the first time, we talked beyond the case, about life, family, and why he joined the force. "I got into this job because I wanted to help people," he said, staring into his cup. "But cases like yours remind me why it matters." Inspired by my experience, I started volunteering with a local nonprofit that supported stalking and harassment victims. At one of their events, I shared my story in person for the first time. Standing in front of a room full of strangers, I felt the familiar grip of anxiety, but I pushed through. "I thought I was overreacting," I told them. "I thought no one would believe me. But one person did, and it saved my life." Afterward, a young woman approached me, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "I've been so scared to speak up, but hearing you makes me feel like I can." While I had reclaimed my sense of safety, trusting others again was a harder battle. Evan's betrayal had shattered my faith in people, making me second-guess even the smallest interactions. Holt noticed this during one of our check-ins. "You've been through hell," he said. "It's okay to take your time. Trust doesn't have to come all at once." I nodded, appreciating his understanding. Slowly, I began to let people back into my life, starting with Lila, then branching out to new friendships. Lila insisted on throwing me a freedom party to celebrate my progress. She decorated her backyard with string lights and a "You're safe and fabulous" banner that made me laugh. The evening was filled with laughter, warmth, and reminders of how far I'd come. Holt stopped by briefly, dropping off a small gift, a journal. "Sometimes writing things down helps," he said with a smile. I opened the first page that night and began jotting down my thoughts, letting the words flow freely. One afternoon, while grabbing coffee at a downtown cafe, I thought I saw Evan's face in the crowd. My heart raced, panic gripping me like a vice. But when I looked again, the man was gone. I called Holt, who reassured me that Evan was still in custody. "It's normal to feel this way," he said. "Your mind is still on high alert, but over time, that'll fade." He was right. Slowly, the fear became less overwhelming, replaced by a quiet strength I hadn't known I possessed. 1 year after Evan's arrest, I wrote another letter to the Sacramento Police Department. This time, it wasn't just for Holt, it was for the entire team that had supported me. "Thank you for believing me," I wrote. "Your dedication gave me my life back." Holt later told me that the letter had been framed and hung in the precinct's break room. "It means a lot to us," he said. "More than you know." Looking back, I realized how much the experience had changed me. I wasn't the same person who had ignored the first note on my windshield, dismissing it as harmless. I was stronger now, more aware, and determined to help others feel the same. The island of fear Evan had trapped me on was gone, replaced by a bridge to a future I was finally ready to embrace. On a warm spring morning, I sat on the balcony of my new apartment, the sun casting golden light across the Sacramento skyline. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt at peace. The fear was still there, lingering in the background like a shadow, but it no longer controlled me. I had faced it, survived it, and come out the other side stronger. As I sipped my coffee, I thought of Holt's words, "You're stronger than you think." He was right.